The position of Aristotle in the intellectual history of Europe is unrivaled. Some might make a similar claim for Plato, but Aristotle's influence was incomparably more extensive, both in terms of influence and in the topics to which he contributed: logic, ethics, politics, economics, biology, psychology, physics, and metaphysics. Aristotle has a strong claim to being regarded as the most influential philosopher who ever lived, writes Tony Burns. His ideas dominated European political thought in the later Middle Ages, largely because of his influence on St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. His classification of constitutions and the politics was still being seriously discussed by Hobbes in his Leviathan in 1651, and Montesquieu in his The Spirit of the Laws in 1748. And George Sabine remarks that, until the 16th century, it was scarcely possible to write a treatise on politics that did not owe a debt to the politics. One of the delightful quirks of intellectual history is that while we have the dialogues of Plato but no record of his academy lectures, we have Aristotle's lecture notes but none of his polished literary productions. And even though we have a substantial body of work from Aristotle, it still represents only a part of his overall corpus. From his dialogues, some of them on politics, all we have is a few quotations. The effect of this historical accident is to distort our perception of the two philosophers. Plato is the imaginative, insightful, and entertaining literary artist, while Aristotle is the original dry-as-dust, dull professor. Nor is this stylistic contrast all. While there is some dispute as to whether some minor Platonic dialogues were in fact written by Plato, and all of his letters are suspected of being inauthentic, there is no serious textual problem with any of the canonical Platonic dialogues. By contrast, Aristotle's extant works are in various states of textual disarray. Some books, such as his De Anima, read from start to finish as a more or less coherent whole. Others, such as his Metaphysics, are admitted by almost all to be a jumble of texts from different times cobbled together into a factitious unity. Of the two works of Aristotle that relate to his political thought, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics, the Nicomachean Ethics is, by general consensus, moderately jumbled, while the text of the Politics is a structural mess. Whether the Politics' textually disordered state is the result of Aristotle's inability to control his material, which is unlikely, or the result of historical transmission errors, much more likely, it is not an easy text to give a coherent account of. What I'll try to do is to isolate the central themes of the work and express them as clearly as possible. A few words on the relationship between Plato and Aristotle before we start. Aristotle, a Macedonian from Stagira and therefore a metic, that is, resident alien in Athens, was a student in Plato's academy for the best part of 20 years. As one might expect, there is a perennial and vexed question of whether and to what extent Aristotle's own work was influenced by or was produced in reaction to Plato's. Some scholars, such as Werner Jaeger, have a general interpretative theory that, simply put, sees Aristotle starting life as a Platonist and then gradually moving away from this position over time. Whether or not this is so, and it is hard to see how it could not be true to some extent, there are some significant differences between the two philosophers, none perhaps so important as the matter of their method. Plato might be described as a unified theory thinker. For him, all our knowledge is in principle subsumable under some one master principle or science, and mathematics is the paradigm form of knowledge. Aristotle, in contrast, could be described as a multiple theory thinker. In a famous passage in the Ethics, he writes, "Our discussion will be adequate if it has as much clearness as the subject matter admits of, for precision is not to be sought for alike in all discussions, any more than in all the products of the crafts. Now, fine and just actions, which political science investigates, admit of much variety and fluctuation of opinion, so that they may be thought to exist only by convention and not by nature. We must be content, then, in speaking of such subjects, and with such premises, to indicate the truth roughly and in outline, and in speaking about things which are for the most part true, and with premises of the same kind, to reach conclusions that are no better. In the same spirit, therefore, should each type of statement be received, for it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things just so far as the nature of the subject admits. It is evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician and to demand from a rhetorician scientific proofs. This contrast in methodology between Plato and Aristotle is not a mere matter of taste. It fundamentally affects how they approach problems and the solutions they offer. Aristotle clearly recognizes the contingent variability of human action, both in individuals and in groups. Given this, there is only so much order we can expect to adduce from human action. Aristotle thinks it foolish to demand more rigour from a given subject matter than it can provide, and human action, whether in ethics or politics, because of its variety and complexity, will allow us to say what is so only for the most part, but not necessarily so. Even if this does not match up to some abstract ideal of explanation, it is still worth pursuing. Unless one is somehow persuaded that only that which is mathematically certain is knowledge, the knowledge we can get in these practical areas is still in advance over ignorance. Human beings, writes Carnes Lord, are inherently variable, and to approach them in the spirit of the physicist or mathematician seeking to discover universal laws is to distort fundamentally the relevant phenomena. For Aristotle, then, we do not generate our basic theoretical principles by pure reflection and then impose them willy-nilly on each and every area of study, regardless of content. Rather, we demand the level of precision that a given subject matter can sustain. In matters of human action, in practical matters, we cannot expect to obtain the kind of rigour that we require in mathematics. Even in Plato's own political thought, we can see him accepting the pragmatic necessity to move from the rarefied theoretical purity of the Republic to the more breathable era of the second-best option of the statesman and the laws, even while he still hankers after the ideal. Just as, in his Metaphysics, Aristotle removes Plato's forms from the transcendental realm and incorporates them in the things of this world, so too he takes Plato's ideal state and embodies it in the context of 4th century BC Greece. The Sophists, who are in some respects deconstructionists before their time, argued that justice was simply a matter of convention, varying from place to place and from time to time. Aristotle was unwilling to accept this view. On the other hand, he was also unwilling to accept the idea that there was or could be only one transcendent ideal political community. As the things around us are composed of matter and form, a certain stuff shaped or patterned in a particular way, so too actual political structures are a combination of material factors, wealth, land, property, and so on, organized in a particular way, which gives them their characteristic pattern or form or structure. One key difference between Plato and Aristotle, then, has to do with the ideal nature of the state. We saw that for Plato, a state governed by laws was the second best compromise, a concession to human limitations. For Plato, the choice was disjunctive, rule by men or rule by laws. For Aristotle, however, there is no necessary disjunction between rule by man and rule by law. The constitutional ruler rules with the consent and for the good of the ruled, and is thus distinguished from the mere tyrant or benevolent despot, who, even if he were to rule for the good of the ruled, would not do so with their consent. George Sabine notes, the precise moral property which Aristotle means to point out is as elusive as the consent of the governed in modern theories, but no one can doubt its reality. For Plato, wisdom resided in the expert, in the one who really knows. Aristotle, while he doesn't totally reject the idea that the best in society should rule, comes to appreciate what has been called the wisdom of crowds, the wisdom that is formed by the living community embodied in reflectively appropriated custom that is not simply a matter of just doing whatever has been done before, but a living, vital custom that sheds the obsolete and adapts itself to the new. It is possible to argue, Aristotle says, that in the making of law, the collective wisdom of a people is superior to that of even the wisest lawgiver. The reason of the statesman in a good state cannot be detached from the reason embodied in the law and custom of the community he rules. So writes George Sabine. As distinct from the modern liberal conception of the state, both Plato and Aristotle agree that it has as one of its functions the moral improvement of its citizens. This is understandable, at least in part, because for both thinkers, the polis, the city-state, was that form of political organisation which was small enough to allow the participation of all its citizens while being large enough to provide the conditions necessary not just for life, but for the good life. Ethics, politics, custom and law all run together in the polis. In respect of a convergence of the political and the personal, the economic and the legal, the historical and the cultural, the modern nation-state is an attempt to reproduce and extend the polis on a gigantic scale. Requiring myth-making of heroic proportions and ignoring the intrinsic physical and demographic constraints of the Greek polis, the nation-state was a project doomed to failure from the start. It is important to remind ourselves before going any further that the use of the English word state to translate Aristotle's word polis, from which his treatise takes its name, could be seriously misleading. The political entity that Aristotle talks about bears little resemblance to the modern state in either size, mode of governance, or status of citizenship. Only in the matter of their both being independent of other states, or polis, can they be said to resemble each other. As I mentioned earlier, the use of state to translate polis is a practice that cannot altogether be avoided, but its possibly misleading connotations must constantly be borne in mind. It is also misleading, by the way, to translate polis as city, if that is meant to suggest an urban rather than a rural mode of life. The Greek polis was both urban and rural. One of the sayings for which Aristotle is most well known is that man is a political animal. As I.F. Stone notes, the English words political animal are, it is true, an exact and literal rendering of the Greek term zoon politikon. But in English this conjures up the picture of a ward heeler who spends his life in the seedy chores of a modern political machine. A polis was a form of community, koinonia, whose constituent members had the right to control their own affairs by debate, discussion, and by lawmaking and enforcement. If the liberal view of the state is that it is an instrument for coordinating and regulating the private associations that make up society, that is certainly not Aristotle's view. The very distinction between state and society is foreign to Aristotle's way of thinking. The city cannot be identified with the state or a form of the state, and the authoritative quality Aristotle imputes to it has nothing to do with the juridical sovereignty that is essential to the modern conception of the state. Rather, it derives entirely from the circumstance that the city, and only the city, is comprehensively concerned with the comprehensive human good. The polis, then, is a kind of community, the one that aims at the highest and most complete human good. The household, consisting of husband and wife and master and slave, is the most elemental social unit, and it provides for man's daily needs. The village, comprising a number of households, satisfies a greater range of needs. The polis, however, sets out to meet all human needs, and its ultimate goal is the securing of the good life for man. Aristotle writes, "When several villages are united in a single complete community, large enough to be nearly or quite self-sufficing, the state comes into existence, originating in the bare needs of life and continuing in existence for the sake of a good life. Hence it is evident that the state, polis, is a creation of nature, and that man is by nature a political animal." Aristotle goes on to say that the polis is by nature prior, both to the family and the individual, since wholes are prior to their parts. This priority is obviously a logical or conceptual priority, not a temporal one. The reason for this priority of the polis to all other forms of community is that neither the individual human being, nor the household, nor even the village is self-sufficing. The polis, however, is a self-sufficing community whose distinctive function is to make provision not just for human life, but for the good life. The polis is a natural entity in the same way as the household or the village, not an artificial or constructed entity. In such a polis, we have a union of people in almost all things that matter: in history, language, customs, laws, religion, music, art and culture. This contrasts with the modern liberal conception of the state as a kind of neutral common arena in which the inhabitants are guaranteed some minimal form of justice and law, and in which their economic or contractual exchanges can be validated. In what way is the polis natural? It's natural inasmuch as the needs which find satisfaction in part in the other and temporarily prior forms of community can only be completely satisfied by it. Aristotle has to meet opposition to his claim that the polis is a natural form of community whose citizens govern themselves on two fronts. Against Plato, he denies that rule should be by a class of experts. Against the Sophists, he denies that the ruler-rule distinction is merely conventional. Among free and equal men, there appears to be no natural orientation of ruler and ruled. How then can governing take place? Since organization of some kind is necessary for the good of the whole, and since no one by nature in the polis is predestined to rule over another, as distinct, say, from the father in the household, the citizens of the polis must be both ruler and ruled. All must govern and be governed in turn. The fact that a ruler at any given time will in turn be one of the ruled tends to moderate any tendency towards tyranny and arbitrariness on their part, and their rule will be such that it will be for the good of those ruled rather than the ruler himself. The three relationships that obtain in the household are master-slave, husband-wife, and father-children. Aristotle robustly denies that the master-slave and father-children relationships are a model for political or constitutional rule. One of the most interesting things about the politics is that Aristotle feels it necessary to provide a justification for slavery. Apart from the persuasiveness or otherwise of his defence, it is a matter of some interest that he should feel obliged to offer a defence of such a ubiquitous and widely accepted institution. He could have defended slavery simply on utilitarian grounds, but he argues instead, with what persuasiveness you yourself can judge, that while some types of slavery are conventional, there are nevertheless some people who are slaves by nature. From the hour of their birth, he says, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. Aristotle defines the slave as a living possession, and the natural slave is one who by nature is not his own, but another man's. That some who are enslaved are not natural slave leads some thinkers to condemn slavery as a whole, but according to Aristotle, this is wrong. The natural slave actually benefits from subjection to his master. Our natural reaction to Aristotle's defence of slavery is to be shocked that such an institution could ever have been accepted by any reasonable person, still less by anyone as intellectually brilliant as Aristotle. But as John McClelland notes, if slavery is just another form of rule, then there is no reason in principle why it should not be examined along with the other forms of rule. Of course, slavery is open to horrible abuses, but Aristotle seems to be saying that the existence of a bad master no more vitiates the idea of mastery than a bad father vitiates the idea of fatherhood. In this matter, Aristotle appears to be trapped by his own dialectic. His argument would appear to run something like this. The polis is a natural and not a merely conventional form of community. As a form of self-governing community, the polis demands the active participation of its citizens in deliberation and judgment, and this requires an amount of leisure incommensurate with either manual labour or business. Somebody has to do this work, and while non-citizen resident aliens, metics, can do some of it, not all that is needed can be done, unless we can conscript those who lack the capacity for self-direction to do it, both for our good and for theirs. One has only to state this argument to see how specious it is. Even if it were true that to be a citizen one has to be relieved of all necessity to work, it doesn't seem outrageous to suggest that the donkey work in a polis could be done by those who voluntarily contract for just this purpose with the citizens. If slavery were merely conventional, then we could have no polis, but that would appear to show that the polis is not, after all, a natural form of community. A little later on, I'll devote an entire lecture to the topic of slavery. But in the next lecture, we'll turn to discuss Aristotle on economics and politics.